really nice to be here. Thank you, Gravity. I just got back from Ohio, like 10 minutes ago, so I'm experiencing a little cognitive dissonance. So I'm going to take you away from California to Germany, but I'm sure as Californians who are aware of various dark things, you will appreciate it. I don't really know how much time I have, and I had wanted to read you, but I don't think I will. I think I'll forsake that in favor of the questions and answers. But I wanted to read you a short story I did in one of my first books called Camouflage, called Poland. And it's nice to read a short story. I realize that the shelf life for listening to a novel is low, and it's nice to hear something complete. I do not drone on about my novel. But what interested me about Poland was that the Second World War had been on my mind without my knowing it for a long time. And just to tell you very quickly about this book, I had heard a woman's voice speaking from the bottom of a mine in northern Germany about 18 years ago. And I wasn't channeling, I knew I was writing, but I produced 16 pages, and I thought, I'm not a novelist, I like to write short stories. That's it. I wrote 3 books in between. And then someone told me, oh, Heidegger's glasses. Heidegger had a revelation about his eyeglasses, and I thought, wow, that's a good title. And I proceeded to do the book, and these 16 pages, which had kept popping out for years, were dormant until I got the page proofs. And I found out that those 16 pages were the DNA for this book. So just to give you a little background, as one always must do with a novel, it takes place in Germany after the Battle of Stalingrad, when Germany was pretty desperate but convinced it would win the war somehow. And there was actually a little-known program, I guess, in Germany called Operation Mail, in which relatives were forced, just before they were led to the gas chambers often, to write relatives letters saying, basically, having a wonderful time, wish you were here. And these letters were not mailed directly from the camps because they didn't want the relatives to know where these people were. They were mailed to the Association of Jews in Berlin. And then the mail system was chaotic. Lots of people wrote letters to fake relatives. They didn't want people to be tracked down. And the result were a lot of big bulging mailbags. And so my what if is, what if the Reich, because it wanted to conceal the final solution, what if it made people who were going to be deported, who were fluent in languages, answer these letters? And I put them at the bottom of a mine that had been sort of romanticized with a cobblestone street and gas lamps, and this just came to me. And people say, well, is that mine really true? And I say, I think not, but Operation Mail was. So our heroine is Ellie Shockton, and the hero, because there has to be that in a novel, sure doesn't have to be in a short story in the same way, is Gerhard Lodenstein. And Lodenstein is one of those Nazis who's kind of caught in the system and doesn't like it. A lot of Nazis were. The head of the secret police was assassinated for getting Jews out on a special secret police program. So he's kind of the same, and they are in charge of the mine. Ellie works for the resistance, but nobody knows it. And she goes to pick up mail. She goes to pick up these letters to bring them back to the mine so they'll be answered. And the only thing that you really have to know, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to these people who wrote the letters and to the compound. And the only little thing you have to know is there's something that Ellie hears about when she picks up the letters. She picks them up every few weeks and makes a foray and saves a few kids in the process, is that there is someone called the Angel of Auschwitz. And the officer at the outpost says to her, you don't believe this, but a Jew just got out of Auschwitz. He walked past the fence with the commandant's blessing. I don't believe you, said Ellie. It's all over the Reich, said the officer. An SS man came to the commandant and said the guy owned a lab, and the Reich needed it for the war, and the guy had to leave it over to sign papers. So the commandant said he could leave Auschwitz, and now they can't find the lab or the name of the SS man. They don't even think he's real. They call him the Angel of Auschwitz. My God, said Ellie. Is that all you can say? It's a fucking travesty. And Goebbels won't shoot the commandant. He said he can't be bothered. So Ellie goes back to the mine, and on her forays, she always brings back a lot of food because she does a lot of favors for people. And there's always a feast, and I'm going to introduce those people through the feast. And of course, she's obsessed about the Angel of Auschwitz, and that's going to drive a lot of her motives in the book. So we'll only start with Ellie, who's sort of looking through Lodenstein's desk to find numbers and maybe names. She doesn't tell him. And because she saves his life from complete absurdity, he doesn't ask why. She's rummaging near the telephone when he came back from breakfast. They huddled under the quilt and drank ersatz coffee, which they agreed was growing weaker and weaker, and talked about soldiers deserting, not enough food, accelerating chaos in Stalingrad. Ellie leaned against him and said she was exhausted. He stroked her hair and asked, trying to sound casual, "Did anything happen at the border?" "I've already told you, no one's checked. They stopped caring." "Then why did you take an extra day?" "The mother didn't want to leave her kids, and there wasn't room in the Jeep. I had to find her a guide to Switzerland." "And the baker?" "What do you mean, the baker? He baked all that bread because I got his niece to Denmark. Why do you grill me whenever I come back?" It was an old conversation. Ellie flirted for favors. Lodenstein got upset. They had this conversation again and again, never resolved it and never stopped loving each other. Ellie's voice was thin, as though she was about to cry. She threw it on her napkin and took the mine shaft to the main room, where she lit the lantern at her desk and wrote down supplies she hadn't been able to get on her foray. Wicks, kerosene, knackbrot. Then she made a list of all the people who might help her find out whether the Angel of Auschwitz was real. She crossed out some names, added others, wrote the names in code, and crumpled the first piece of paper. Later she would burn it. Ellie was always burning papers. No one in the compound worried when they saw small fires in the forest. While Ellie worked, the scribes played word games and wrote in diaries and answered a few letters from Operation Mail. Sometimes they typed one or two obligatory sentences, and sometimes they answered at length by hand because something about the letter writer moved them. Maybe the handwriting reminded them of a parent, or the writer mentioned a town they knew, or the letter was written the day they'd been scheduled to be deported. They kept these letters for themselves and didn't send them to be stored in crates. Now and then, one of them came across a letter from someone they knew, and there was weeping, mayhem, and commotion. Not today, though, and Ellie, as always, ignored them. Sophie Knockgarten picked up her pen. She just read a letter from someone in the district of Fürth, the same district she lived in with her lover. There had been a line-up in the town square, and a guard shouted, "Stand straight," in an accent that Sophie recognized as Norwegian. On an impulse, she said, "Of course," in Norwegian, and was pulled from the line. It was a good guess. The guard had been raised in Norway. And while her lover was taken to the gallows, Sophie was pushed into a Kugelwagen. That's a jeep. "Dear Margot," she began, "I don't know you, but we live close by. So close we could have touched each other in the marketplace." Ellie let the scribes do what they wanted because it didn't matter how many letters they answered. Goebbels threatened to visit but never came. And as for the building they planned to exhibit letters after the war, Ellie knew it would never happen. Germany could barely feed her own people. These letters would never be read, and neither she, the scribes, nor Lodenstein wanted to support a blasphemous distortion of history. Except for those arrested crossing borders, most scribes remembered being pulled from a lineup in a town square, or a crowd that exuded panic while surging towards cattle carts. They remembered being quizzed and understanding their life depended on knowing a foreign language. Then a series of confusing car rides, then a glimpse of a shepherd's hut, their startling descent way into the earth, and their relief when they met Ellie Shockton. Now she stood up and clapped her hands. "It's time to get ready for the feast," she said. Within moments, scribes arranged 18 desks side by side, and 18 more facing them. Ellie found candles and wine glasses in a broom closet. A scribe named Parvis and Officiant set out pitchers with water from the well. Sophie Knockgarden took the mine shaft to the forest and came back with pine boughs that made the air fresh and the desks into a banquet table. They brought out platters with ham and chicken and bread and cheese. Ellie lit candles and poured wine. And then she banged on a metal pot. "Everybody come," she said. "It's time for the feast." People began to appear from the most unlikely places. A short man in a skull cap and a taller woman with a long red braid came from a tiny house at the end of the cobblestone street. A green-eyed woman in an ermine coat darted from a corner. A blonde woman with a cigarette holder and an elegant man in a long black coat walked out of Ellie's old room, and Lars Eisenschur, an 18 guard who barely fit into his uniform, came from the mine shaft. As soon as Lars saw the man in the skull cap, he pulled out a seat for him and cut him a huge slice of bread. He sat behind him for the rest of the evening and poured wine for him and the woman with the long red braid. Soon 58 people were around the table, Lodenstein at one end, Ellie in the other. I should stop right now?
Yeah, well, finish the paragraph. I mean, you're over time, sorry.
Okay, well, just let's say, above in the shoebox of a watchtower, a man with a large face and several chins leaned against the glass. He seemed weighted by his chins, trapped in a different element. Ellie Shockton nodded to Lars, who left the table and went up the winding steps to the watchtower. Soon the heavy man was sitting next to Ellie. She patted his arm and filled his plate with food. "To each and every one of us," said Ellie. "To all of us in the compound," said Lodenstein. Over 20 scribes touched glasses with the heavy man. He was surrounded by arched backs, bowed heads, curved arms. The sound of glasses filled the room like bells. "To victory," he said under his breath.